Well, you sort of, thank you, Susan. You started maybe entering into my next question, really, about Israel's attempts, often successful, I mean, most often successful, to destroy Palestinian culture. How Israel controls the narrative about Palestinian displacement and dispossession and disappearance, even, about Israeli Hasbara, propaganda. Talk about Palestinian agency. Where do you find that? The need for it, and this idea of controlling the narrative.
Right. So Israel has. So when Israel was established, right, they put forth this extremely romantic notion of a violated, displaced people returning to their homeland 3,000 years later, right? Even though it's an illogical, fantastical sort of fairy tale narrative that does not comport with reality and what we understand about migration and what we've known about history and archaeology and historic events, it was for the West the perfect ending, a perfect happy ending to a really dark chapter. To Western crimes, right, against their own people, their own a subset of Western cultures. European Jews were very much European. They were a subset, I guess, of the culture that was villainized and reviled within Europe, not within the world. That was not the case in the Arab world. Arab Jews, whether in Iraq, Tunisia, Morocco, Iran, those would be Persian Jews, were very much part of the society, even though they were subsets. Like every society has subsets. So it was, and Israel was able to promulgate this sort of narrative because they were already part of European culture, and they spoke in European languages, and they understood the nuances of European cultures, Western cultures, and they could disseminate this narrative. Palestinians were Arabs who spoke Arabic, whose literary traditions were in Arabic. We weren't. The West wasn't really accessible to us, and the West didn't have access to us as a culture instead of subjects. They had access to us as their subjects. So that was the beginning of the proliferation of the first iteration of the Zionist narrative, right? But then you sort of go on in history a little bit more, and this Palestinian resistance starts to develop. And Palestinians first start going from one court to another, one country sort of begging, pleading, and nobody listens to us. Nobody wants anything to do with us until Palestinians started hijacking planes and reacting violently. Suddenly, there was no ignoring Palestinians. And suddenly they knew, they understood that there was already a people here with an established and ancient culture and history, and those homes and those cities that Israel had moved into, in fact, had been built by Palestinians over centuries and millennia. And so now the narrative was, okay, but there's these violent, crazy people that just are anti-Semitic and they just want to kill Jews. So, but that we don't actually exist. I mean, that was Golda Meir's thing, right, that we're just this hodgepodge people of miscellaneous Arabs. Then, continued Palestinian resistance, which manifests itself a little bit later as the first Intifada, which was principally unarmed, right? It was rocks. It was children with rocks who were being mowed down by Israeli military. And so now there was a new narrative that they had to contend with that they could not ignore, which was a truly violated indigenous population that was permeating international consciousness. So Israel then finally decides to shut that down by entering into an agreement with the Palestinians and creating this sort of, which they've admitted to as being basically buying time. The Oslo Accords was a way to end this Palestinian popular intifada, popular resistance, and pretend that there's hope. All the while, they continue this sort of rapacious settlement building and eating up of the land and destruction of Palestinian society, all under the guise of negotiations. Very much like what settlers did in this country to Native Americans. And so now we arrive at this moment of Palestinians like myself and countless others who have grown up in the West, who articulate our stories in Western languages and the nuances of Western culture, our art and so forth. And so now the West has access, and we have access to the West, and the West has access to our stories, and it conflicts with this fairy tale, the Zionist mythology. And the way they contend with that is by shutting us down, by villainizing us and sort of slapping the anti-Semite label on everything and on BDS. And what's extraordinary is that these efforts have gone so far as to basically put a cross through the First Amendment in the United States for Americans who wish to stand in solidarity with Palestinians. So you could lose funding, you could lose business opportunities, you could lose jobs if you don't pledge allegiance to Israel. In essence, that's what agreeing not to exercise your First Amendment right when it comes to Israel. Yeah. That's what all this anti-BDS legislation is all about. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Yeah.